Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the museum and the independent sector for really putting together an outstanding program. And I also want to thank all of our speakers and panelists for really highlighting the power of service, the importance of service, and also a number of the kind of critical issues that we're going to be facing, that our country is going to be facing, the concept of service is going to be facing over the many years and decades to come. Also like to give a shout out to a number of the Rotarians who've joined us this afternoon from the DC metro area. And it was a real pleasure to hear some of the great service projects they're doing. So thank you guys for coming, and keep up the good work. Also a shout out to one of my closest friends from college, Steve Culbertson. Steve's the president and CEO of Youth Service America. And Steve, thank you so much for your many years of dedication to the concept of youth and service. And thanks for coming. And so as we prepare to celebrate our country's 250th anniversary, the organization that I lead, Rotary International, is approaching a milestone of its own. In just a few years, Rotary is going to turn 125 years old, nearly half the age of the United States. Now, Rotary began in a law office in downtown Chicago on a cold evening in February of 1905. Four men gathered in a small room. An attorney named Paul Harris, along with a coal dealer, a mining engineer, and a tailor. Now, Harris had moved to Chicago from rural Vermont, and he had frankly found the city overwhelming. He found it vast, transactional, and lonely. Everywhere there were people, he wrote, but nowhere a familiar face. And so he wanted to build something that existed in the small town that he had left behind in Vermont, but did not seem to exist in his adopted city of Chicago. And so what he wanted was a way for people in different trades to know one another, to meet regularly, and to do something together beyond their own business. And so the four of them agreed to rotate their weekly meetings among their various offices, and that's frankly where the name Rotary came from. And then we discovered that this quintessential American idea was portable. It didn't begin as a revolution, but it became a global movement. Within 10 years of its founding, Rotary clubs had spread beyond Chicago to every major American city. By 1921, there were Rotary clubs on 6 continents. And today we have 1.2 million Rotary members in 46,000 clubs across more than 200 countries and territories who live the Rotary motto of service above self. And there was a great deal of talk on some of the panels about how do we quantify the value of our service activities. Well, a number of years ago, we undertook a fairly significant project within Rotary, working with Harvard and with Johns Hopkins. How do we quantify the worldwide value, the annual value of our 46,000 clubs, the service projects we do, the philanthropy, the volunteer hours, the in-kind contributions? And we came up with a credible figure of about $2.4 billion a year. A small drop in the bucket, but nevertheless a meaningful contribution to that 120 billion figure that was mentioned earlier in one of the panels. Now, for an idea to have a lasting impact on the world, it has to take root in different soils. And Rotary's core idea is offering practical responses to real problems. We exist to help people form lasting, meaningful relationships and friendships in a complex, interconnected world through service, community, and interpersonal relationships. And what Paul Harris started in Chicago has, over the past 120 years, become something I would say larger than its origins. And Rotary's American roots are part of the story. They're not the whole of it, but they never were meant to be. And so the question before us today is about the nature of American service itself. And what I'd like to do is approach that question from a more global perspective, from a sort of more macro perspective, and from two different vantage points. For 5 years during the George W. Bush administration, I served as the Vice President of Operations for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC, which was a U.S. government agency that was formed back in 2004 to deliver U.S. international development assistance in a new and innovative way. Now, MCC was designed to be selective, country-led, and rigorous, and it was willing to walk away from country partners who are not delivering. And for the last 15 years, I've had the enormous pleasure and honor and privilege to lead Rotary International, which was built on an equal but opposite premise. In our model, you show up, you stay, and the relationship itself is the centerpiece. Now, both of these concepts and both these approaches have been rapidly evolving in recent years. The governmental, institutional approach is being dismantled, and the other is being asked to carry weight it was never designed to carry alone. Now, you've already heard about most of the numbers on the international development pullback in the media over the past year, so I won't retread them in detail. But what I do want to underscore is the synchronized character of what we're seeing. Official development assistance is down across over every major donor country: the US, UK, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and it's all happening within roughly the last 18-month window. This is the post-World War II donor architecture being reduced across the board. And the human consequences are unfortunately very, very visible. The 2025 Gates Goalkeepers Report projects that approximately 200,000 more children under the age of 5 will die in 2025 than in 2024. And that would be the first absolute increase in preventable child's deaths this century. And I'm not here to relitigate the political decisions behind these numbers. What I'd like to do is to describe what they will require of civil society. Now, the question I get most often is whether someone else will fill the ever-growing gap. And the short answer is that no one will, not at this scale at least, and not in the areas of greatest need. What is being withdrawn is not being replaced like for like by other actors, whether they be state or private. Even major global players like China and the Gulf states are spending development funds in different ways that require major adjustments. That, unfortunately, is the environment that we're living in. What is ending is the post-war order that we have called multilateralism. It was built on country-to-country interactions, on treaties, on global institutions. It was a system designed in the mid-20th century to address the problems of that era. That order, unfortunately, is fracturing, even as technology, paradoxically, continues to shrink the world. What is emerging in its place is something that I would like to call people-to-people multilateralism. It's built on direct connections and agreements among people across borders rather than on the country-to-country architecture that defined the old system. It does not, I would say, replace state action, and it frankly cannot, but it continues when state action contracts. And this, in my view, is where civil society's real opportunity lies. What I learned at MCC was that aid worked best when it was disciplined. That meant clear criteria for where to engage, country-led agreements in which governments themselves set priorities, time-bound agreements of 5 years rather than open-ended commitments, independent evaluation built in from the start, and the willingness to terminate programs that were not delivering. That approach produced results, and I would argue that it still does. But its discipline depended on an ecosystem. MCC compacts ended on schedule because USAID and other actors remained to carry on the long-term relationships. Independent evaluation was meaningful because there was institutional capacity to carry on the findings. Disciplined exits worked because partner countries had somewhere else to turn. MCC's discipline was effective because the coalition around it was intact. That, unfortunately, is changing. And there's a temptation in a moment like this for civil society organizations to say that we need to be more rigorous, more like the private sector. And I think that some of that impulse is right. Measurement matters, honesty about outcomes matters, and a willingness to stop doing things that don't work also matters. But we cannot simply import the playbook of the institutions that are pulling back. Our instruments are different. Long relationships, distributed networks, and patient capital measured in decades rather than fiscal years. Our discipline must be suited to those instruments. So what does an effective civil society version and service at scale look like when it's working? Well, the first example is the work that Rotary and its partners have done for more than 4 decades in our quest to eradicate polio from the face of the earth. Rotary is a founding partner back in 1988 of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, or GPEI, alongside the WHO, UNICEF, and CDC, and more recently the Gates Foundation and Gavi. And since 1988, Rotary has contributed more than $3 billion to the polio eradication effort. Now, and our members have given countless hours of volunteer time, organizing immunization days, advocating to governments, and raising funds in every country where we operate. And the results of that global service initiative are real. We've seen a 99.9% reduction in polio cases worldwide since we began back in 1988. And the wild polio virus is now endemic in only 2 countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so we're closer to eradication than humanity has ever come with any disease other than smallpox. But the job is not done. The GPI 2026 Action Plan anticipates substantial budget reductions across surveillance, outbreak response, and laboratory capacity, a direct consequence of the donor retreat that I described earlier. And what that means in practical terms is that finishing polio now depends more heavily than ever on whether the civil society side of that equation, that coalition, can hold the line while the state side withdraws. It depends on whether Rotary's networks in 200 countries can raise more, whether we can advocate harder, and whether we can absorb more of the load. That's a live question. It's certainly not a settled one. And it's also the question that will determine whether the last 2 endemic countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan, go to 0, or whether we'll see a resurgence of polio around the world. And polio, once it rebounds, does not stay where it started. A disease that's not finished anywhere is a disease that's not finished for those of us here in the United States either. Now, a second example is Ukraine. Since February of 2022, when the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine occurred, Rotary has provided more than $100 million in direct aid to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian refugees. Roughly $20 million came through our Central Rotary Foundation Fund, and the other $80+ million from club-to-club interaction and Rotarian-to-Rotarian interaction. And that aid's taken the form of generators, winter heating for hospitals, medical supplies for rehabilitation centers, social support for displaced families, and educational materials for children. And over that same period, formal ODA, or official development assistance to Ukraine, declined by approximately 16 to 17% between 2023 and 2024 as donor attention and budgets shifted to other priorities. The phrase I use for what Rotary is doing in Ukraine is diplomacy and service from below. It's not a substitute for state action, and it can't be. but something that continues when state action contracts. Our work helps sustain the social fabric in communities facing catastrophe. In Ukraine specifically, it relies on long-term relationships between Ukrainian clubs and clubs in Germany, Poland, Austria, Lithuania, Czech Republic, and many, many other countries. These are relationships that existed before the war and will exist after it. They carry information, money, supplies, and social trust across borders, and at a speed and a granularity that formal institutions, frankly, cannot match. Now, polio and Ukraine are different problems, but they are the same kind of answer. Both are people-to-people multilateralism, people-to-people service networks, operating across networks that were already in place before the current retreat began. And again, civil society is not going to replace the full architecture that's being reduced. And we should be honest that there will be real losses along the way. But civil society is now part of the system, I would argue, with the most room to grow. And people-to-people multilateralism and global service at scale is the shape of that growth. And so that's where I'd like to spend the rest of our time together this afternoon. The organizations in this room share something in common that's very important. And that's whether the work you do is domestic or whether the work you do is international. And this is a very, I would argue, old American idea, certainly far older than Rotary. The impulse runs through the abolition societies, the settlement houses, the public libraries, the agricultural cooperatives, the immigrant aid societies, and the mutual aid associations of the 19th century. It's one of the oldest American habits, and we heard a great deal about this in many of the panel comments. Alexis de Tocqueville believed that Americans' capacity for forming volunteer service organizations was the root of our democratic power. He believed that through these organizations and the creation of civil society, Americans learned how to act in common. And what de Tocqueville was describing in modern terms is service as a unifying practice. People with different backgrounds and loyalties, whether it be political, religious, commercial, come together around a concrete piece of work, and in doing so, they come to know one another. Service has been one of the few things that consistently unites a country whose default condition is argument. But de Tocqueville also believes something much darker. He wrote, "A people among whom particular persons lost the power of doing great things in isolation, without acquiring the ability to produce them in common, would soon return to barbarism." And so the work we do is rooted in deeply American principles and has importance beyond the specific service projects that we do. You know, we're all organized around citizens rather than governments and states. We're all built on the premise that the people acting together can do what institutions, often by themselves, cannot. We're all, in different forms, expressions of the same underlying idea of service, philanthropy, and working together for the common good. And unfortunately, that idea is being tested once more. And the work of the next decade is figuring out how our networks operate as a coherent civil society response rather than a set of parallel efforts. And that will require having much harder conversations than we've been having. We're going to need to talk about measurement, about failure, about comparative advantage. We'll have to identify where we are duplicating and where we are leaving gaps. We'll have to confront what it means to take on work at a scale we're not yet fully built for. And it will require us to scale up faster than we're used to, in ways that will at times involve mistakes. You know, in the past, at times, civil society has tended to treat its humility about scale as a virtue. In the environment we now face, I would argue, that humility is starting to look like an excuse. We're going to have to do more, we're going to have to do better, and we're going to have to do it together. And we're going to have to bring along the people who will do this work after we have long departed. Now, the post-war architecture was built by a generation that's now leaving the stage. What replaces it or does not replace it will be built by people who are now in their 20s. And Rotary, and many of you here, invest a great deal in our youth. Rotary invests through its youth exchange program. We run one of the largest youth exchange programs in the world. And through our Interact clubs, which are clubs that are based at the high school level, 12 to 18-year-olds, sponsored by a Rotary Club, designed to do service. And our Rotaract clubs, which is for 18 to 32-year-olds, again, working in conjunction with a Rotary Club to carry out service in their communities. And through our Rotary Peace Fellows, and all of the myriad of other projects that we do supporting youth around the world. In an area where the center of gravity is shifting to people work, these programs are really not peripheral to what we do. They're the core. They're the core of what we do. And they're the mechanism by which this tradition continues at all. Now, I began these remarks with 4 men in a Chicago office in 1905, and I'd like to conclude there as well. Paul Harris and his 3 colleagues were not trying to build a global network, a movement. They're trying to solve a small, local, specific problem. That is, how to know one another in a city made knowing difficult while serving the community at the same time. The institution they created turned out to be portable because the problem they were solving was not actually a Chicago problem. It was a modern problem, and modern problems travel. Which brings me back to the question I raised earlier, whether American service is something we do only within our borders or something that's always extended outward. And I think the honest answer is that Americans have never really had to choose. The same civic instinct that built volunteer fire companies and town libraries in the 19th century is the instinct that carried Rotary to 6 continents in 20 years. It's the instinct that sent the Peace Corps abroad and that built AmeriCorps at home. It is one tradition expressed in 2 directions, and neither direction weakens the other. What is distinctively American about it is not where the work or the service happens. It's that the work is done by citizens, organized across differences, doing together what none of them could do alone. For organizations represented in this room, every year, I would argue, is a year of service. The 250th anniversary of our great nation is a useful occasion to take stock of that tradition. But it is not, I would argue, a destination. That idea of citizens organized across differences doing what governments alone cannot has been tested before, and it is being tested again as never before in our history. And so what we do next is a test of its durability and continued success. Thank you very much.